I'm Stephen Burns, Medical Co-Director of the Northwest Regional Spinal Cord Injury System. The forums, the video recordings, and our online media content are made possible by a grant from the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research. Tonight we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Michael Boninger, Professor and Chair of the Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation Department at the University of Pittsburgh, where he also serves as the Medical Director of the Human Engineering Research Laboratory and Director of the Spinal Cord Injury Model System. Dr. Boninger's talk tonight is To Walk or Roll, the Controversy Over Walking and Research. Dr. Boninger.
Thanks. Thank you. So I have to tell you a couple of different things. One is that I try to never give the same talk twice. So I edited this talk on the way here. There's new things that came out, and I realized that I forgot to edit this slide. And so this is an outline of the talk. I used to only torture people by describing three studies. So there's two about the wheelchair as an enabler and a disabler, and one on walking, and I added two more studies in. So now you'll be tortured with a few other studies. There's another disclaimer I want to tell you, in that this is a talk that I put together primarily for clinicians. And I went through it today and I didn't change it at all, except for adding additional studies. And I'm kind of excited to present it to a group of people with spinal cord injury and get your take on this. I think that it's an interesting topic, and we'll go through, and this should be interactive. So I will be asking your opinion along the way. To start with the disclaimers, the conflicts of interest, well, I see a lot of people using natural fit push rims, and I have to thank you for that. I have the patent on the natural fit push rim, and so for every natural fit push rim in the room, there's about a quarter I think I've received. So there's about $2 worth of conflicts of interest, I think, in the room, and I appreciate that. I have one other patent, and I'm not going to talk about either one of the patents tonight. I do not do consulting except for special circumstances. Right now there is a special circumstance in that I was asked to chair to be on a data safety monitoring board for a spinal cord injury curative research trial, and agreed to do that. And so that's the only conflict I have. The data safety monitoring board is what determines whether a trial can go on or not. And so my role is to make sure that it's being done safely. In my mind, that's the kind of conflict of interest I can live with. I'm not being paid by the drug company to sell the drug or to research the drug, just to monitor the trial. So I want to start this with a case. And so here's your case. George is a 27-year-old financial officer at Chase Bank, and he's hurt in a diving accident resulting in T10 level injury. So there's no motor or sensory preservation below the level of injury, so he's got a T10 or complete paraplegia. George vows that he's going to walk out of the hospital, and when he's introduced to a wheelchair, says he's not interested in learning how to use it. So we can, for the clinicians in the room, and for for wheelchair users in the room, the question is, what do you do? So he's on an inpatient rehab unit, and what he's saying is that he doesn't want to learn anything about the wheelchair. And he has a complete spinal cord injury, and what we know about complete spinal cord injuries, if there's no sensory preservation and no sensory sparing or motor sparing, the chances of recovery aren't that great. There's not a right or wrong answer to this question. Let me ask a question to the audience. For those of you in a spinal cord injury, how many of you with a spinal cord injury in the first week said, I'm going to walk out of here? I don't care what the doctors say. The doctors, I've heard this story before, I'm going to walk out of here. Raise your hand if that falls in that category. My first study that I tried to conduct was a wheelchair study. I do research on shoulder pain, and you're not going to hear about any of that tonight. And the goal of that study was to look at how the shoulder is affected by propelling a wheelchair. And what I wanted to do was recruit people who were newly injured before they started using a wheelchair, so they're still in bed, and have them have an MRI before they went through that, and then follow them over time. And I couldn't recruit subjects because, to a T, almost every single person I talked to said, I'm not going to need a wheelchair. I'm going to walk out of here. And I think that's normal. That's a normal part of the injury. I have a couple of other things, how would you change that if the person has an incomplete injury? So now what we know is that there is research out there that if you have some leg movement, that you might actually regain more leg movement and might actually be able to walk. There is a group of people, 20% of people who have spinal cord injuries don't need a wheelchair long term. How does it change if the person's part of a minority group and unable to be able to afford home modifications? Do you then spend time in, so that their inpatient unit, what I think, to state the obvious, but just so that it's out there, we know that part of what you need to learn after a spinal cord injury is how to maneuver a wheelchair, how to drive one, how to use one. But if you have no home modification, maybe you need to learn how to walk then. What if they're independently wealthy? So should that factor into the equation of how you answer that question? And we'll talk about that more later, and we'll return to all of this. And what if it's a year later now? They still have a complete injury. They're in a wheelchair. Should they be focused and they want to learn how to walk? What do you do as a what do you say as a clinician? So now I'm going to walk you through a couple of studies that I find interesting, and again, I think there'll be some opportunities for polling. So one of the questions that we had early on, working with a guy named David Gray, who's an occupational therapist at WashU, not the University of Washington, I got it right, was what factors limit participation in the community? So what is it that keeps individuals with spinal cord injury from going out, from doing more after an injury? And we did a really simple thing. He had a survey called the PARTS that looked at barriers. We found a group of people in Pittsburgh and a group of people in St. Louis, and we asked who had a spinal cord injury. They were at least a year out from their injury, so stabilized, and used a wheelchair for over 40 hours a week. And we asked them all of the questions that are part of the PARTS. It's designed to look at participation according to the International Classification of Function, which we don't need to talk about a lot today. And it looks at 3 activities: moving in the home, leaving the home, and transportation. And the responses are divided into a couple of different sections: participation limitations. So what about your health is limiting you? And another one, which is a non-health related participation. And there's some interesting quirks in this. So we had 70 subjects who were part of the study. The average age was 41. They were on average 14 years post-injury. There were 29 people with tetraplegia, 38 with paraplegia, 54 manual wheelchair users, and 16 power wheelchair users. So here's what the question kind of boils down to: is your participation in moving around your home or leaving your home, transportation, limited by, and this is kind of the medical stuff. Interestingly, because the wheelchair is meant to take care of a medical problem, it's going to be listed twice. So if I asked you in the room, what keeps you from getting out more? Is it fatigue? And by the way, everybody has to answer this question, not just the people in a wheelchair. So if you're here with someone that's your partner who's in a wheelchair, or you're a clinician in the room, or you just wandered in off the street for the cookies, I'd like you to try to answer this question. What do you think would be the #1 ranked thing? Is it fatigue that limits you? You have no limitations. Is it pain? Is it your impairment, your physical impairment, your spinal cord injury? Is it your wheelchair or your wheelchair seating system? So we're going to go by a show of hands. By the way, they're right now they're listed alphabetically. So if you and again, here's how we'll differ this. If you're in a wheelchair yourself and you want to answer for you personally, what's the most limiting factor? And for the clinicians, what you think the people you work with spinal cord injury, what your patients are going to answer. So how many people think fatigue? Raise your hand. So I have 2 or 3 for fatigue. How many people would say they have no limitations? So this is wonderful because that's the people in the wheelchair that are saying that primarily. So that's great. How many people would say pain? A lot of pain research has gone on here, and a couple. Has your hand been up more than once back? No. How many people would say your physical impairment is what limits you? 3. The wheelchair. One person says the wheelchair. Okay, and then wheelchair seating. That seemed like a little bit of a stretch to me. No one ever votes for wheelchair seating. So here are the results. So the number, these results were, by the way, amazing to me. The number one factor limiting participation, according to this survey, was the wheelchair. We have one person who got the answer right, according to this survey. Right? Survey says, it limits their ability to move, to leave the home, for transportation. So what's surprising to me, or what was surprising to me, is that the physical impairment, the spinal cord injury, is not seen as the limiting factor anymore. So it's not that for the group of people in this study, it wasn't that my legs don't move. That's why I can't get out of the house. It's my wheelchair doesn't work. And an interesting question would be, why is that? So we'll just go on, and then so now there's the access part of it, and now is it finances that limit what you can do? Is it the lack of assistance? So these are now all external, and again the wheelchair appears twice. Is it the environment? Is it stairs? Is it social attitudes? Or is it the wheelchair? And without putting you through the torture of that again, the wheelchair wins in a bad way. The wheelchair is the thing that is the external to the person that is now limiting their ability to get out in the community. So we thought about this for a while, and how it could be that the wheelchair, the device that I think, actually I would say there is no argument, the most enabling piece of technology that we can provide is seen as the thing that's creating the biggest limitation. Well, so I think there's a really easy answer to that. So for those of the people wearing glasses in the room, when I can't see out of my glasses, it's not because my eyes don't work. It's because my glasses are dirty or I have a bad prescription. That's exactly, as a clinician, as a doctor, this is the right answer to the question. It's not about the spinal cord injury anymore. You got a spinal cord injury. I got bad eyesight. I need glasses, need a wheelchair to get around. Clearly, the wheelchair, according to the people surveyed here, needs to be improved. I think it's great that in both, there is a group of people that say, I have no limitations. I use a wheelchair 40 hours a week. I can do everything I want to do. That is, by the way, where we want the answer to be. This is what we want to drive towards. I think it's interesting. So, what we know is there's limitations to the study. Small n, and it seems like this group may have answered it differently, although in the context of the survey, who knows? But what does this mean? I think we talked about this. Why is this device that's so enabling considered a barrier? So we want to kind of figure out why, what the barriers are, and clearly what this seems to be indicating is there's room for improvement in the wheelchair. So the next question was, how often do wheelchairs break, and what are the consequences? Because if the wheelchair is the problem, there must be something wrong with the wheelchair. So together, and by the way, every single study that I'm going to talk about today is funded by the exact same grant that's funding this lecture. So this is a Model Systems grant out of Pittsburgh, led some of the data collection, and I'm happy to say that we're going to do some of this study again. And the University of Washington is going to be participating. So there's a whole new group of questions that they're going to ask, I think, as we go along. So the basic question is, how often do wheelchairs break down? What are the consequences? Are there any associated parameters? It's a Model Systems study. All we really did was ask people, and here's another chance for a survey, did your wheelchair break down in the last 6 months? So for the wheelchair users in the room, raise your hand if your wheelchair has required a repair, even if you could do it yourself, in the last 6 months. All right, so now, just out of curiosity, the non-wheelchair users in the room, If your car has required a repair in the last 6 months, raise your hand. You know, I do this in front of residents, and they drive bad cars because they're still in training. So I have to. It's much better when you do it in front of a group of people who aren't necessarily residents who are working, and because every once in a while their board go up, then it ruins the whole point. And then the other one, if yes, what were the consequences? And I won't ask you all of that tonight. And again, we only were interested in people who use their wheelchair 40 hours a week. We got 1,700 respondents because the beauty of the model systems is you can collect this data rapidly. You can see the numbers here, 1,300 manual, 800 power, so it's a pretty big sample, almost evenly split. Occupational status, 500 working, 1,000 unemployed. Again, not an unusual number. And here are the unbelievable results, which were, actually verified by our very quick sample here today. 44%. Now, what I should tell you is this study ended in 2006. So this is old information. This was from 2004 to 2006, I think. It'll come up in a minute. I might have got it wrong. So 44% of the people, and do you think that if almost half the people had a car failure every 6 months, that there'd still be a car industry? Or, I mean, what would be, so if Ford's, and I think they did at one point, failed every 6 months, you'd stop buying a Ford. Well, we don't know actually that can work in a medical marketplace. There are more repairs in power and more adverse consequences. Here are the consequences. So these are the number of people who were stranded, the number of people who were injured. This is in the last 6 months. The number of missed work or missed medical appointments. So a pretty significant outcome from the wheelchair. And so we repeated this study. We did the exact same thing with the smaller group from 2006 to 2011, and it went up, significantly went up. This paper, this is one of the new studies. So this paper was published, I think, a week ago. Actually, interestingly enough, the journal that published it chose to do a press release, and I was interviewed on NPR, but it didn't make national NPR. But so at least it made the news a little bit that we're providing crappy wheelchairs to people. And is it the PTs in the room fault? I think it is. No kidding. I'm kidding. There's a quality issue. And what we also found was more consequences. We found that people now, compared to the previous survey, have less backup chairs. Now, what conveniently happened in there was the crash into the economy in 2008, kind of on the cusp there, and they're more likely to impact people who have Medicare and Medicaid. This is what it looks like when you compare them side by side. The percentage of people who've had a breakdown who were stranded went up, injured didn't change, missed school, missed medical appointments. How are you supposed to work if you can't get there reliably? That's a problem. Again, we don't know the type of repair. There's limitations to all of the studies I'm going to tell you about today. All the subjects. Now, so here's another thing to think about. This is model systems. All of you are supposed to have gotten better care than maybe people who didn't go to model system centers. I actually believe that model systems probably provide better wheelchairs. So the chances are that if we surveyed everyone who's using a wheelchair more than 40 hours a week to get around with a spinal cord injury, that the number would be worse, right? And in fact, because of the way the Model Systems grant works, there's probably people who are more new subjects, got new chairs, so they even had less chance to wear them down to the point where they should be breaking down. The failures of these impact. Now, what can we do about it? So there's a standard that wheelchairs are supposed to live up to, by the way. It's an international standard. It's been vetted. And this standard says that you should be able to pick up a wheelchair and drop it basically 6,000 times. We have the equipment in my laboratory. The the way they enforce that, the way the FDA enforces it, is they tell the wheelchair manufacturers they can test their own chairs in their own facilities, and they can test as many chairs as they want. So if you're a wheelchair manufacturer, you can build a better chair, or you can just test 20 of your crappy ones until one is abnormal enough to pass all the standards. We've actually repeated it. We buy chairs every year. We test them to failure. They don't pass. And then there's CMS's policy, which says we're going to pay you this amount of money, and the wheelchair company that produces the least expensive chair makes the biggest profit. And the dealer who sells the chair that costs the least amount of money makes the biggest profit. It's no wonder there's a problem. Obviously, we have to try to do something to fix it, and there's room to improve. So we wanted to look at another thing. Again, I'm tripping up at the new points of the talk. So we just completed a study. This is not yet published. And we wanted to say, okay, let's look at all the wheelchair users that are being discharged from these wonderful model systems grants and see how skilled they are at using their wheelchair and what predicts the skill, and is there any relationship between the skill and quality of life. All right, so and there's a test that was developed called the Manual Wheelchair Skills Test, and we had each of the wheelchair users complete this test. We evaluated them. Again, this is part of our NITR study, and we collected all this information, demographic information, quality of life information. So the next slide is busy. Can everybody read that? Is that do I have to delete more columns? In the back row. Can you see that? If you can. This is where I would normally walk to the screen. The wheelchair skills test. So this is the test. So just as an example, can you roll backward 5 meters? Guessing everybody in the room can roll backwards 5 meters. Not surprisingly, everybody in the survey could roll backwards 5 meters. What about, can you go up a 10-degree incline? Well, if you have tetraplegia, this is only manual wheelchair users now. 63%, 67% of the people couldn't do it, right? And then you start getting into more advanced skills like popping a wheelie, and you get some really low numbers. Can you climb a 15-centimeter curb? I'll tell you that if you have paraplegia and you're pushing a manual wheelchair and you're in reasonably good health, you should be able to climb a curb that big. It takes effort. I can do it. Without using my legs. That would be cheating. But what it takes is training. You have to be able to pop a wheelie. You have to be able to hold a wheelie, and that's one of the things here. Can you turn 180 degrees in a wheelie? I'm not going to ask the people in the room here if you can do that, but only 60% of people with paraplegia. That, I think, is a travesty. I'll tell you that my practice is in wheelchairs. That I believe that if you can pop a wheelie, you're less likely to fall out of your chair. You know your center of gravity. You know your balance point. And so there's a lot of gaps in what people who are using wheelchairs can do. And when we related this to quality of life, we found that there was a direct relationship or a correlation between quality of life and your ability to perform certain skills. The bottom line is probably the only one you have to worry about. The bottom line shows you that if you total up the wheelchair skills test, if you look across all the skills, there's a relationship between self-perceived health, and these are chart mobility scores, and this is your total chart, and these are the R-squared values. So they're small. What these numbers tell you is that a portion of someone's quality of life is just predicted by the skills with which they can maneuver a manual wheelchair. Not really surprising, although an interesting thing to be able to pick up in this study. Again, model system centers where we should have the best, and we're not doing that. So why? Why don't people have better skills? You know, there's probably a couple of different reasons that we know about. When I trained, and I'm old, but I'm not that old, you could be in the hospital for 3 months if you had a spinal cord injury with the level of paraplegia. Now if you're in the hospital for 30 days, you're lucky, right? So you know, that's one part. Another part is we can't give people wheelchairs while they're in the hospital. The rule is that if we buy you a wheelchair in the hospital pays for the wheelchair. If we wait till you're discharged, that's when you get a wheelchair. If you wait till you're discharged, then your insurance pays for it. So there's no hospital that, you know, wants to keep their doors open that can afford to go out and buy everybody a wheelchair that comes into the unit, right? So there's one other thing. Is it possible that there's a lack of focus, that wheelchair users are not all that interested in learning how to use their wheelchair? So we started with the case study, and I had you raise your hands if in fact you thought to yourself that you were going to walk out of the hospital. And it was a problem. I don't know if I had to do percentages. What, 30% of the people in the room raised their hand and said, I thought I was going to walk again. So the next research question is, does a focus on ambulation while you're on the inpatient unit impact recovery from or adjustment to spinal cord injury? Now, there's a couple of things that made me ask this question, right? One is that as long as I've been doing this, and probably 10 years before me, there's been a researcher willing to get up in front of a group of people with spinal cord injury and say, the cure is 5 years away. So for 30 years, we've all been listening to people say there'll be a cure in 5 years. Well, if you're 23 years old or however old our patient was, and you're sitting in a hospital bed and the cure's just 5 years away, why should you learn to use a wheelchair? That's 5 years. You know, you can think of it as a short prison sentence maybe, right? Why would you bother? And then there's a new focus on ambulation that I've been seeing and that prompted this talk. There are the robotic exoskeletal walkers, there's the neural recovery network, there's the locomats. When I say this stuff, is everyone in the room familiar with this? So there is a pre-conference workshop at Asia this past year on walking and spinal cord injury. There's constant seminars on walking and spinal cord injury. Well, if you get on the web, you want to get on the web, you'll find stuff about walking and spinal cord injury. So you go, your loved ones, if this newly injured person, their loved ones are going to go on the web and they're going to find all this stuff about walking. I think that there's a chance that makes people want to focus on walking. And by the way, every single physical therapist and occupational therapist I talk to tells me this is true, that patients don't want to learn they want to get up in the parallel bars, they don't want to learn the wheelchair skills. So we have this short length of stay, and we have a group of people that doesn't want to learn the wheelchair skills. And I just had to put this up there. How many people heard about this woman who completed the marathon, spinal cord injury, completed a marathon all over the newspaper? I read about it in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. This happened in London, right? It took her 17 days to complete the marathon, which I have to point out that if she had been pushing a wheelchair, she probably would have beat the runners, right? We all know that wheelchair marathoners are way faster than the runners. That's why they have to start early so they don't run them over. And you know, this is the press that's out there. I mean, there's this part of me that wonders whether my patients are wondering if the fact that they're not walking is a failure. So there isn't a great way to look at this from a research perspective, but I'm a researcher, so you try to figure things out. So we did something and there's a medical student, Melissa Riggins, she's probably a doctor by now, who worked with me for a summer and got this study done and went into the Model Systems database. And what we found is if you go in the Model Systems database, one of the things they look at is the FIM. And we asked, and one of the questions on the FIM is, do you walk? Are you an ambulator? Or do you use a wheelchair? Or do you have an equal use of ambulation and a wheelchair? That's how it's phrased. So it's an outcome measure. And we divided people into 4 groups. And we asked this question at discharge from the hospital, and we ask it a year later. And so we divided people into 4 groups. One group was they walked out of the hospital, and then they continued to walk a year later. So we know that that's true in again, about 20% of people with spinal cord injury who go to rehab. There was another group that walked out of the hospital and a year later was using a wheelchair. So in my research mind, that's a group that wanted to learn how to walk even if they weren't going to be functional in it. Why else would they change? There's another group that was using a wheelchair and then walked a year later. And then the final group was using a wheelchair all the way along. And the AA group is ambulation to ambulation. AW is ambulation to wheelchair. WA and WW. We looked at outcome measures. They're similar to the ones we've already talked about. The participation measure, we looked if they were satisfied with their lives, their health status, patient health questionnaire, depression, and pain severity. Here are the demographics of the population. And what you see is that there's the number of people who went from ambulating to using a wheelchair is relatively small, 55. So we're basing this on a small number, but it's there. You can then what is underlined is the places where there were significant differences. And this last line here is probably worth looking at. This is the lower extremity motor score. Basically, it's how strong your legs are. You know, and your doctors are, you know, asking you to do the manual muscle testing, and they're checking the strength of your legs. So we looked at the lower extremity motor score. And what you'd predict is there. The higher the score, the stronger someone is. So people who walked had a lower extremity motor score of 43. People who used just a wheelchair and stayed in it the whole time had a lower extremity motor score of 4 on average. The people who went from a wheelchair to being successful at ambulation had a score of around 33, 38. And the people who went from ambulating to wheelchair use had a score of 22. So this group was weaker, probably why they weren't able to consistently walk. But, you know, of note here, I think, is they're way stronger than the group that was in the wheelchair and stayed in the wheelchair. And if you know the literature in there, you'll know that one of the things that I think is, again, a testament about some of the things that we do well. It's a testament to the people with spinal cord injury and to the clinicians who work with them, is that your happiness with life is not related to your injury level. People with tetraplegia can be as happy as people with paraplegia and as happy as the general population if their wheelchairs would stop breaking. But I'm repeating myself. So you're going to see a recurrent trend here. This is what you're going to see is that in every single category, the people who went from walking when they left, people who had more function of their legs, went from walking when they left to a wheelchair a year later, had more depression, less likely to participate according to the chart. So that's the lower bar here. Higher pain severity. This is the one place they didn't want to be better than everybody else, and they are. And lower satisfaction with life. All of this being significant differences, and a regression showed that 21% of the variance could be predicted by these 4 factors: mobility change, education, race, marital status. And if your mobility change, if you went there, that means that 21% of the score that predicts whether someone is going to have pain or life satisfaction is because of this group. Again, kind of another slide that says the same thing. So it's a cross-sectional study. The FIM as a mode of locomotion, this isn't perfect, right? That wasn't meant to do this study, but it was a way for us to gain some insight into it. We don't know why people transitioned. So there's a chance that they were, walking just fine and got hit by a bus. We wouldn't know that. But if you had to think of why they transitioned and you look at our data with a critical eye, it seems pretty obvious that they weren't successful. They couldn't walk fast enough. It was too much of a toll, and they finally realized that they needed a wheelchair. So something that maybe everyone in this room accepted on some level during their rehabilitation stay, it took them months to accept. Again, another limitation is that it's a small number of subjects. So for the most part, the small number of people, wheelchair users, did that. We're doing the right thing, and that's good. But why these differences? So we know that there's this really short time in rehab, and if you spend any of that short time in rehab not working on the skills that you need to get around, it can have a big consequence. And if more of the people with spinal cord injury, more of our patients when they're in the hospital, our clients when they're out of the hospital, are working on wanting to walk and are trying to avoid the wheelchair skills because it's a sign of a disability, then it can cause a problem. There's an interesting racial difference here. I think I might have skipped over that. The ambulatory to wheelchair group, I shouldn't go all the way back, but the ambulatory to wheelchair group was much more likely to contain African Americans or non-whites. That's an interesting one that we don't really know the answers to as to why that would be the case. One thought is that if you can't afford a home modification, so it's a socioeconomically challenged group. It's not just that they're non-whites. That's the other part of this that we looked at. Is it possible that they felt like they had no choice? I don't really know. Is it another thing that we know from the literature and from some of our own work and that we're going to explore a little bit further with the University of Washington in the next Model Systems grant? Is that people from a minority background tend to trust their healthcare providers less. So if they read on the internet that they're going to walk and their doctor says they're not going to walk, then just maybe it's their doctor or therapist not telling them the truth. So what about George? Again, you've heard my perspective on this. What concerns me is that is what's out there in the marketing. I think there are people marketing walking programs, and the part of this is you can get a gym membership for a few $1,000s a month to use the robotic walkers if you're in the right location, and I think that's why the wealthy is there. They're wealthy, well, of course they need to learn how to walk. Insurance isn't going to cover it. A year later, again, it's keeping this alive. Now, Christopher Reeve, the Neural Recovery Network, came out of his work. He got up and he walked every day. And I have to tell you that, so you should know that in my department, we do cure research. I have a researcher. I don't allow him to say he's 5 years away. We don't know how far away he is, but we're going to keep doing that research. We do robotic training research. We don't do robotic walking research right now. And I think that there's a future in exoskeletons, maybe. It's way away. So that exoskeleton that person completed the marathon in 27 or 17 days, it'll keep getting longer, is a precursor to maybe a device that'll be fantastic at some point. There's this part of me that feels like it'll get fantastic not because of spinal cord injury. It'll get fantastic because it'll have another application, a military application or something that's gaming related, because that's where the marketplace is. There's not a great marketplace in spinal cord injury, but I love seeing this work. I do technology work. I do brain-computer interface work myself. I love seeing work that I think will make a difference in the lives of spinal cord injury, but I'm a doctor first, and there are clinicians in this room, and it's imperative. One of the things that you have to do is have the hard conversations about walking, and I think that it's incumbent upon all centers to present this in a way that is true and in the best interest of their paper and of their patients. And in the meantime, where should the research funds go? I think we need to continue to fund cure research, but we know that the wheelchair stinks. It breaks down every 6 months. Now, I'm a big fan of the wheelchair. It's been my research career for the most part until recently. And you know, what I tell the residents is this is the most important prescription you'll ever write. Right? Tell me another medication that can take someone who would be stuck in bed otherwise and make them completely independent. We need to do more work on it. We need to come up with better wheelchairs that get over barriers, that last longer. We need better prescription. But there's this emphasis on ambulation. And by the way, it's not all the clinician's fault. We know that the hands went up. It's hard. I've never had a spinal cord injury. I haven't been in your shoes. Right? I imagine, knowing who I am, I'd be one of those people saying, I'm going to walk again. You're wrong. Right? But you know, the clinician has a responsibility then to say, well, here's what we know. And by the way, the other great thing about that study is look all the people who went from wheelchair to walking. Starting out in the wheelchair in that first year, in the first, you know, just out of rehab, it's okay. And I will be the one saying where the fund, you know, I'm the one who says this is where I think funding should go. We need to work on, it's, you know, split it evenly. It's not being split evenly right now, by the way. Okay? From my perspective, right, cure versus a spinal cord injury, this plays itself out in the medical population all the time, right? Well, if I was an orthopedic surgeon, I can give someone a hip replacement at the bat of an eye, right? They have pain, they get a hip replacement, $100,000 of medical expenditures done. If that same person has a surgical contraindication for the hip replacement and needs a wheelchair, I have to fight like hell to get them a $5,000 wheelchair. You know, what's wrong with that? That's my rant. I am happy to take questions and discuss this further. This is the first 3 papers. If you search under Boninger, there's not a lot of us. Oh, my son just wrote a paper. So if you see Jay Boninger, that's my kid. You'll find these studies. They're all published. There's nothing here that I've said that isn't published. And so I appreciate your attention and happy to answer any questions. The question was, have I heard about a chair made in Italy called the Jenny? They took Segways, which is the balancing two-wheeled device that DECA manufactures, and they are modifying them to make them into a wheelchair of sorts, which, by the way, right when the Segway came out, someone stuck a chair on it and sat down in it, and there's a researcher just a couple hours north of here named Bonnie Swatsky who did a study on that in Vancouver. And now that you mention it, so I'm familiar with this. Again, I think there's a lot of technological innovation. Part of where the Segway came from was a wheelchair called the iBot, and I was involved in the initial studies of the iBot. And so for those people who don't know, the iBot was this weird-looking wheelchair that had 2 wheels on the back of it, where there was normally 1 drive wheel, and then it had a front caster. It's a power wheelchair, and the iBot could stand up on those 2 wheels. So while the person remained seated, they raised higher in the air and you could talk to them at eye level. The iBot could also, those 2 wheels would rotate and you could go upstairs in the iBot. You can argue what killed the iBot, but I think what killed the iBot, and I actually wrote an editorial to JAMA, which they soundly rejected in almost no time at all, the Journal of the American Medical Association, about this, that what killed the iBot was that issue of how medicine is reimbursed in this country. The hip replacement, I used that story in that letter. We can build a better wheelchair. There's no doubt we can build a better wheelchair. If you can build a car, you can build a better wheelchair. We're not. And we need, and that therein lies the problem. You shouldn't have to jury rig a Segway, right? You should have an iBot. We're modifying a technology to make it work for wheelchair users is great. And again, in some ways, that's how we're going to get there. that we're going to take advantage of the technology advances that occur elsewhere. And so if you work in engineering and you work in technology, these are solvable problems. The reason it's stagnant in the U.S. is because of how healthcare is delivered in this country. It's because of how and it's different for prosthetics, right? It's this unbelievably stupid rule that says the wheelchair is durable medical equipment, which dates back to the fact where wheelchair users didn't used to leave the home. And that's why it's considered a whole different class of device. I mean, we need to get politically active on this too. In the cacophony of people screaming about cuts that are coming, it's going to be hard to be heard. And we're a really easy group to ignore, people with disabilities. What's my view on cure research? What's my view on research related to walking? And you started off by restating the point about 5 years for a cure in diabetes as well. So a question about cure research that one could ask is, so why is it always 5 years away? Is it that the people doing the research really think it's 5 years away? Why is it 5 years away? Well, 5 years is just a kind of a long enough period of time to be hard to be, real accountable for, as opposed to like 2 months, and quick enough to raise funds, I think. And so you save 5 years, and you have someone who's newly injured who wants to walk again, and the next thing is often, we need your help. That part of it bothers me, and the fact that I think it arrests people in their recovery bothers me. I am a huge supporter of the Miami Project. I've been down there. I'm a huge supporter of cure research. I'm a supporter of walking research. I think that where I have a problem is when it's not tempered. When it's not tempered with realism, when I have a problem when it becomes the focus. The people in the room, it'd be interesting, right? How many of you would donate money for a cure? How many of you would donate money for wheelchair research? I can't even say, right, would I mean, I don't know. It's so fundamentally different, right? You want the cure. Everybody wants the cure. I want the cure. And we need to work towards it, and there's great research being done at the Miami Project, at many centers. I can name the researchers who are doing fantastic stuff, and I don't want to stop them. I want them to keep going. I just don't want that I'm not alone in saying this, by the way. There's others, but I just don't want that to cause my patients to not go on with their lives, because that's what's happening. If you told me that you're going to pay money to do exercise towards walking, and I don't know if you're incomplete or complete, so it's but if you told me that you're going to do that, and the wheelchair is a temporary obstacle, then we have to have another conversation. And by the way, I'm happy to have it with you. That's what every single doctor and therapist has to say. When they stop saying that is when it's a problem. I saw a couple other questions, or it got answered.
What are some of your ideas about how to put pressure on the entities that control wheelchair quality to improve quality?
We just have to keep bloodying ourselves. I mean, we're part of what we're going to do with the data. So we collect this data. What is not up there yet, and I just have to find another brilliant medical student like Melissa to write it up, is that we know the makes and manufacturers of all the chairs. I actually called Consumer Report again. We've had discussions with them, and so we're starting that again. We're going to a publication out of our lab will be telling you which ones break more often. So we're going to do that, and we're going to do that as part of our new module, and we'll publish them widely. Whether that'll get, what I really would like Consumer Reports to pick it up. We had talks with them about 10 years ago and then renewed them a little bit, and we're going to work on that so it gets a little bit more popular press. So that's one thing that we can do is out them. And you know, the problem is that, so you know, I got interviewed by the local NPR because I'm from Pittsburgh. Didn't quite make national news. It seems like it should, right? With everything that's going on in healthcare reform, the fact that the government's paying for most of the chairs, health insurance for the government, you know, you can go on Medicare when you have a spinal cord injury, and so, but it doesn't. So we need to keep the pressure on. We just need to keep bloodying ourselves a little bit. I feel like I've been fighting this for a long time. You've heard me fight this for a little while, and every time I kind of lose a little steam, I get a medical student like Melissa or a patient come into my door, or a conversation with another researcher, and it lights a fire, and we do another study and find out things aren't getting better. The question is, can I speak to competitive bidding, and is it active in my jurisdiction? So we were not one of the pilot sites, or at least so competitive bidding, for people who aren't aware, is that you would go to see a doctor or a therapist, or both, and a wheelchair may be prescribed, or specs would be prescribed, and then the lowest bidder would be able to provide the chair. I get that pretty much right? And the implications there is that the dealers that provide the best service would not necessarily be the one prescribing the chair, and there's a whole bunch of things that our center takes advantage of, like home visits done by the dealers, and all of this would go away. My understanding is that it's pretty likely that there'll be an exemption for high-end wheelchairs that will likely impact spinal cord injury. Is that your understanding as well? For Group 3 power chairs, true, not for manual chairs. Again, it's horrible, right? This is just another way that this is going to get eroded, and I think that we were in Washington recently when we were talking about, right? I'm remembering this at the White House conference, and there is a conversation related to what we have to do to keep things going. And and really, we need to. It's not going to be me screaming that's going to change anything. It's going to be you screaming that's going to change things. Which, you know, in and of itself could be another risk of focusing on that cure. You're in a wheelchair today, so there are some good organizations like NSCIA, the National Spinal Cord Injury Association, which are member organizations for people with spinal cord injury. I would encourage everyone in this room to get politically active. This is, it's your issue, and they won't listen to me. They won't. They think that, there's just, every single doctor has something they want to testify about. So the question was, how do you balance, in someone who's got an incomplete injury, so has a chance to ambulate and be an effective ambulator, and you used a term that I'm going to ask you to define, which is person-centered care. And how do I balance the neuroplasticity research and the need to have wheelchair training? So for the sake of discussion, I'd like you to define person-centered care for me. So the definition of person-centered care is that the individual's goals would factor into the discussion, or would be what would help direct my goals. There's a piece of terminology, and this is a great group to discuss this with, right? Which is someone with a spinal cord injury my patient or my client? And that's been something that we've talked about, that has been a term that's been bounced around a little bit. Now, this is if they're my patient. We're not talking about someone on the street, right? So you're a person, right? You're a person. If you come to see me and I'm your doctor, you're not my client. You're my patient. And so I think that there is an obligation amongst people, amongst physicians, amongst clinicians who deal with patients, to have hard conversations and at times to refuse a certain degree of treatment if it's not in the person's best interest. So if I'm a doctor and someone comes to me and says, I have a cold, I want you to give me antibiotics, and I know that antibiotics are not the right thing to do, I'm not going to practice person-centered care. I won't. And so that's where, now if I work at Best Buy and they want a really big screen TV that won't fit in their dining room, I could care less. They can have their big screen TV. They're a client. They're not my patient. And that's how I draw that line. So I need to make that point first. I think that the clinician's responsibility for their patients is to say, this is what's best. Now, the discussion for me really centers around my assessment of whether, so again, for an informational point, there's a debate right now related to neuroplasticity, and the debate is, if you wait while someone has a spinal cord injury, if you wait and don't exercise legs, that a connection might not be made that would otherwise be made, and you could actually then be impairing their recovery by allowing them to use a wheelchair. And what I'll tell you is that by my read of that literature, and I'm not an expert in this area, this is not a conclusive argument. It's not set. And in fact, there are equal number of studies that say by doing that, you might actually be impairing recovery. That when you stress a tax system, these are mostly animal models, so these are studies done in animals, that you actually hurt the person's ability, the animal's ability to recover. So this is far from being a solved problem. So I don't factor that part of it into it. What would factor it for me would be my assessment of their ability to be an effective ambulator when they leave the hospital. And then the way I would practice person-centered care would be to listen. We have a locomat at my institution. If someone wants to get up and walk in the locomat, more power to them. If they want to get, and I personally think, again, if I try to put myself in someone's shoes who's got a spinal cord injury, which I can't do, but to the best of my ability, I think that I'd certainly be one of those people that would want to keep my legs flexible, that would want to keep cardiovascularly fit, that would want to do it if I could, some type of FES, so that I'm getting the workout that I need, so that if there was a cure, I'd be ready for it. It's just a matter of sequencing it all. And what we know is, what I believe is, and what I think we know, and by the way, we'll be able to follow people over time and look at how these numbers change, is that there's something you have to learn in the first year of a spinal. There's things you need to learn in your first year of a spinal cord injury, and that's where I feel like I'm repeating myself. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I think that it comes down to this balance and of hope. Again, I think that I would never say to someone who says to me they're going to walk again, no, you're not. I think, first of all, I don't know enough to say that. And second of all, I got people doing Q research in my lab, and I've seen miracles in medicine. When you practice of medicine, I think you realize how little we know. And so things happen. And so I'd never say that to anyone. What I'd say is, I'd say there's a chance of that. I think that there's a chance you're going to walk again. And I personally want to do everything I can to help you walk again. But what you have to do first is live your life. And right now, living your life means living it from a wheelchair. And what you learn your wheelchair skills, you practice your wheelchair skills. That's what I'm going to ask the therapist to do with you. That's what we're going to be working on. And as you work through these wheelchair skills, we can start talking about what you can do to prepare yourself for the cure, what you can do to maximize your neuroplasticity, and we can start working on that. But let's do this in the right order. The question was that I knew there was a person who was in a wheelchair, had electrical stimulation of her muscles, and was able to walk again, and then ended up in a wheelchair a little bit later. So I could talk for hours about that. see the person who finished the marathon in 17 days, there's a really good chance that that person was supporting a lot of their weight on their arms. What it used to, for kids with cerebral palsy and with spina bifida, it used to be you walk. We don't care that your legs don't move, you walk. And they'd give them Lofstrand crutches, and if you've seen Forrest Gump when the big long braces, and that's how people walked. When you walk with paralysis, there are changes that happen, even if you strengthen your muscles with electrical stimulation, that can lead to biomechanical, your legs move differently and can lead to injuries. Injuries of the joints, all types of injuries. Again, I'm a big fan of sports, wheelchair sports. Do the wheelchair sports. If you want to try to walk with a spinal cord injury, walk. But it is one of the risk factors, again, that comes from if we swing it all the way to the extreme where even if your legs don't work, you walk, I guarantee you, and there's been really good studies on this, that your shoulders will wear out way before, that will wear out quickly, and that you'll lose the ability to walk at some point and end up in a wheelchair anyway. So that's a common story. So the question is, in rehab, when you're in acute rehab, are there numbers that you can put on what are the chances I'm going to walk? And can you put that in a framework of numbers that might help with the decision? So the answer are the numbers exist. They're absolutely out there. And there's no reason why you couldn't have been presented with those numbers. We know, based on people's injury levels, what within some reasonable certainty what the odds are that they'll be walking again. And by the way, they're kind of they're in there a little bit. You could look at the range, and that's lower extremity motor score. Ask your doctor what your lower extremity motor score is, and you can see how you fit in there. And this is not the first publication to look at it. There's people who know those numbers better than I do. But I have to tell you a story related to this, because this is where it gets hard. So my first day as a resident in rehabilitation, or maybe within the first week as a resident in rehabilitation medicine, I admitted 2 kids to a spinal cord injury unit. One kid was involved in a motor vehicle accident, and the other kid was accidentally shot by his brother. And they were both high cervical level, vent dependent tetraplegia is what they had. And I was on the pediatric rotation for 3 months, and about every other day their mom or their dad would come up to me and say, when are they going to come off the ventilator? And about every other day I would say, I don't know that that's going to happen right now. As a doctor, what you try to do is give a glimmer of hope and a big dose of reality, because that's the job. It's hard to hear things in acute rehab. When you're laying in bed with a spinal cord injury, there are patients who will swear up and down that I never told them X. I told them X. They're a bad listener? No. What it is it's a traumatic event, and you can't process it all. You can't even hear it all. So I'm not saying that you were told the exact numbers, but what I'm saying is that even with the numbers, it takes a lot of effort. It's a process. The numbers are helpful, but it's a lot of times I believe that on some level, it's when the patients are ready to hear the numbers that they actually start listening to the numbers. Up until then, it's challenging, and then it's a difficult conversation to have. So some doctors are uncomfortable with that. When I was an intern and I was on the oncology unit, I was the person that they said, you go tell him he's got cancer, because somehow or another it seemed like I got the reputation as the person who could have that hard conversation. I think that those are difficult conversations to have. You have to have them over and over again, because in a hospital bed a week after a diving accident, if we take our client, they're not going to hear it the first 3 times you tell them, which makes it that much harder. And the clinicians in the room are bouncing their heads up and down on this one. it's tough. It's a really challenging thing. What else should we do? What else should you do as an individual with a spinal cord injury if you want to work on standing, walking, and ambulation? So there's a few things that are absolutely critical. Which, by the way, this is like a plant, isn't it? So here's one big one, and a really, really hard one, and maybe the most important thing that you can do, and that is watch your weight. Okay? You want to stay fit. By the way, that will help you in your wheelchair propulsion. That will protect your shoulders. That will do all of the things that you need to do. So watch your weight, and that's going to be impossible because the big muscles that burn calories are not burning them anymore. And you have to work on it from a whole different perspective. It just takes more. And the only way to watch your weight is to eat less. Actually, that's true for me too. The fact of the matter is that the myth of exercise as a way to losing weight is really pretty much a myth. It's about eating a little bit less. So watch your weight. I think another thing that you have to do is stretch. Again, this is something that is good for you as a wheelchair user and good for you as someone who wants to walk someday. If you have a flexion contracture at your knee and can't bend your knee all the way, then eventually that can become an impediment to you ever walking or ever standing. So stretching is a huge part of what you want to do as well. So we have exercise. We have, then I think that weight, watching your weight, stretching, and then lifting weights, cardiovascular exercise are difficult to do. They're boring. I think that there's things we don't know about what the cure will bring. So will osteoporosis be a problem? And what we've seen recently is the medications for osteoporosis have some pretty significant side effects. Would I take an osteoporosis medication just because I want to keep my bones healthy in spinal cord injury because there might be a cure? No, I would not. And so there are a few other things. I would, if you can afford it and can stand, I think there's a ton of benefits from standing. I have a direct message in my presentation. But if you can get into a standing frame, it's a great stretch. I think that it's a great way to stretch. I think that if we had standing wheelchairs, we'd cure pressure sores. It's a great way to get rid of pressure sores. So if you can get into a standing frame, get into a standing frame. Those are probably the major things that I'd focus on.